Fox News alert on our top story. We have been following breaking news developments for the last couple of hours on the deadly terror attack in Libya that left 4 Americans dead. Fox News learning from sources on the ground in Benghazi that as the terrorists stormed our consulate, 2 former Navy SEALs requested permission to come to the consulate. They were about a mile away and save the life of Ambassador Stevens. They were told to stand down 3 different times. Here is what we know. Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty, the 2 former Navy SEALs, were part of a small team who were at the CIA annex, again, about a mile from the consulate. As the consulate came under attack, that was about 9:40 p.m., and these 2 heard the shots. They reported the fighting to headquarters. They are told twice to stand down because they had called an hour later and again requested permission. And again, they are told stand down. So that's twice told stand down. Meantime, Ambassador Stevens is inside of a room that is filling with smoke because the terrorists have set the consulate on fire, and he will ultimately die of asphyxiation. Woods, Doherty, and at least 2 others ultimately decide to ignore orders and head to the consulate anyway. The place is on fire. They are taking fire, and they call again for backup. Again, the request is denied. 4 hours later, they have returned with the body of Sean Smith. They were unable to find Ambassador Stevens or his remains, and they returned to the annex under heavy fire. 4 hours later, the fighting has died down, and Woods and Doherty are found dead from mortar fire, we believe, that they were fighting back at the annex. Back in Washington, D.C. at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 90 minutes after the fighting first began at the consulate, the President, the Vice President, and the Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, gather for a meeting in the Oval Office. We are told they knew about the attack and had intelligence from the ground. Let's pick up that part of our story with Andy Card, who was the former White House Chief of Staff under President George W. Bush. Andy, welcome back to the program. And so now we know.
Good to be with you, Megyn. Oh, this is very troubling, very troubling.
Now we know that the President was having a meeting with the Defense Secretary at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Now we on the East Coast are 6 hours behind Benghazi. So at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, it's 1 a.m. Benghazi time. And at 1 a.m., the ambassador, we believe, was dead, but the fighting was continuing at the annex, and Doherty and Woods were still alive and begging for backup that was never sent. Andy, put it in perspective.
Well, having worked at the White House during times of crisis, I'm aghast that we would have had these officials meeting in the Oval Office and not being counseled to offer guidance or direction. And I just don't know what the conversations would have been in the Oval Office in this circumstance. But my experience tells me that the National Security Advisor, the CIA Director, and probably the Chief of Staff would have been involved in these meetings, and there would have been a healthy debate over what to do. But you don't debate forever. You have to make decisions. And when American lives are at stake and American national interests are at stake, you have to act and lead. So I'm very troubled by this information. It also I'm going to complicate the challenge of trying to address why they didn't tell the American people about the nature of this attack after they knew what it was. So I think there are many troubling concerns to this latest information, and I don't think it's credible to say that the President or others were waiting to learn more about the nature of everything before they commented about it. They knew about it almost real time.
Doherty and Woods wanted to get to that consulate to try to save the life of the ambassador who they knew was there. They were told twice, don't do it. They ignored orders. They went anyway. They weren't able to save him, but they did help get a security guard into the car and others and headed back to the annex. For the 3rd time, once they got back to the annex, they radioed in and said, send us some backup. Again, they were denied. No backup was sent to the annex, Andy, and that is where 4 hours later from the time they called for backup, those 2 were murdered. They had a gun on the person who was firing mortar, who was responsible for the mortar fire, that would ultimately kill them. They had a gun trained on him, and were asking for the special forces that could actually take advantage of that situation, and they were denied. Now, that was after the Oval Office meeting. So the President was already aware, we presume, we have yet to get direct answers, was already aware of the situation there, Andy. We are also told one other complicating thing, that not 1 but 2 Predator drones were over the area watching this, and Jennifer Griffin reports that would have been fed back. They are capable of sending back real-time visuals to the Situation Room at the White House. Your thoughts?
Well, the descriptions are very credible. I think the White House Situation Room would have known all of this, and they would have had kind of real-time information to share with the President, the National Security Advisor, the Head of Homeland Security, the Chief of Staff, obviously the Vice President and the Secretary of Defense. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I'm sure, was made very aware of everything that was going on. I just can't believe we have these two true patriots that kept saying they wanted to go help the ambassador and they were denied it. And then when they needed help for themselves, they were denied it. So it's almost irresponsible. We lost a phenomenal diplomat in our ambassador. We lost brave patriots that were trying to do the right things. And as far as I'm concerned, they are really heroes to try to save the ambassador and then to even ignore the orders and go do what they thought was right to save the ambassador who was representing America's interest there. And they must have felt terrible when they got there and realized the ambassador was already dead or at least taken away, and that they had to bring a body back with them. And then they called for help and it was denied. It's just incredible to me. And the denial at the White House after the fact is even more troubling.
Is there any chance the president talked to Leon Panetta, who has now come out and said, Leon Panetta has, there wasn't a clear picture of what was happening on the ground, and you don't send troops in when you don't have a clear picture? Is there any chance the president deferred to his defense secretary, who was telling him it's not safe, you don't move troops around unless you have a firm grip on what's happening?
Well, there's always a fog of war, and I'm sure that the fog was very dense and it was hard to see, and you didn't know really what was happening. But when you have credible people like Doherty and Woods there reporting real time, these were not hair on fire people. These are pretty level-headed people. And for them to report that they needed help or wanted permission to help first and then needed help second and were denied, it's incredulous to me that we allowed their vision to be overruled by the vision that was not very clear in Washington, D.C. I think the benefit of the doubt should have gone to Woods and Doherty, who had probably a clearer understanding of what was going on than people in Washington, D.C., just because of the nature of the fog of war. But clearly, it was a shame that they were denied an opportunity to do what they thought was right vis-a-vis the ambassador, and then they were denied the protection that they should have had just because they were patriots for America doing a job that America asked them to do, and they had a credible expectation that America would provide support for them.
Andy Card, thank you so much.
Thank you, Megyn.
Well, we taped that interview just before the show. We have since learned that while Tyrone Woods did go to the consulate, Glenn Doherty actually flew in from Tripoli later and went right to the annex. Moments ago, President Obama said he was unaware of requests for more security in the weeks before the attack. We're right back. I want to clarify two things in that interview with Andy Card, because as I said, we did that, we taped it right before the show, and then we learned that Glenn Doherty wasn't actually one of the guys who went to the consulate. I clarified that before, but also my math was off, which I'm sure you noticed. 5 p.m. here in the East Coast wouldn't have been 1 a.m. in Libya. It would have been 11 p.m., so my apologies on that. And just one other point of clarification on something. We're told that these requests for more protection, for backup, that this would have been within the line of the CIA command, that they would have gone to Langley, we're being told. It's not a military denial. It is something that would have been under General David Petraeus and possibly in the White House Situation Room, but it's not something that the Pentagon necessarily would have been in control of. Nonetheless, Leon Panetta, the defense secretary, did weigh in on this and said, look, you don't move troops until you have a clear picture of what's going on the ground, and not in reaction to today's news, but in response to the news has been building up for the past couple of weeks. He said that. So I don't know if that clarifies anything, but that's the situation as we know it.